right, well, we are back in Ezra, and as we said at the outset of our study, Ezra has two major divisions, or two major sections, and we've been in this first section, the chapters 1 through 6, and we saw there that these chapters deal with the first return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon, and then the rebuilding of the temple. This took place under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. And Zerubbabel was in the royal line of King David, and so he would have been the legal heir to the throne if the Jews were not under the other nations that had conquered them. Joshua was in the priestly line of Aaron, and so we saw that the king and the priest were also encouraged by the words of the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. So the God-ordained leadership of the nation was present, the prophet, the priest, and the king. In these chapters, we read about Persian King Cyrus authorizing the exiles to return, the list of those who returned, the rebuilding of the altar and then the temple, the opposition to the rebuilding, and the completion of the temple. And we saw the commitment of those who returned as well as the challenges they faced in attempting to rebuild the temple. This would have encouraged the original readers of the book to be involved in true temple worship. It was to remind them to fulfill their covenant obligations because of God's mercy. In all this, God was working behind the scenes, bending the hearts of kings to do his will. Well, tonight we'll begin the second major portion of Ezra as we look at chapter 7. This section deals with the rebuilding of the people. The narrative moves forward several decades from when we left off in chapter 6. And at this time, there's a new king on the throne, King Artaxerxes, who was the king of the Persian Empire. Well, Ezra returns, and he comes back with a much smaller group as he returns to Jerusalem. And so at this time, the temple has been successfully rebuilt, but Ezra finds the people were in need of rebuilding in their spiritual lives. So let's take a look at chapter 7, and I'll read that. And again, if you'll make note of any important words, we'll do our overview in that way. So Ezra chapter 7. Now after this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, the son of Seraiah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Merioth, son of Zerahiah, son of Uzi, son of Buki, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the chief priest. This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of Yahweh his God was on him. And there went up also to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king some of the people of Israel, and some of the priests and Levites, the singers and gatekeepers, and the temple servants. And Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. For on the first day of the 1st month he began to go up from Babylonia, and on the first day of the 5th month he came to Jerusalem, for the good hand of his God was on him. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of Yahweh, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in manners of the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, peace. And now I make a decree that any one of the people of Israel, or their priests or Levites in my kingdom, who freely offers to go to Jerusalem, may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and also to carry the silver and gold that the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem, with all the silver and gold that you shall find in the whole province of Babylonia, and with the freewill offerings of the people and the priests, vowed willingly for the house of their God that is in Jerusalem. With this money, then, you shall with all diligence buy bulls, rams, and lambs, with their grain offerings and their drink offerings, and you shall offer them on the altar of the house of your God that is in Jerusalem. Whatever seems good to you and your brothers to do with the rest of the silver and gold, you may do, according to the will of your God. The vessels that have been given you for the service of the house of your God, you shall deliver before the God of Jerusalem. And whatever else is required for the house of your God, which it falls to you to provide, you may provide it out of the king's treasury. And I, Artaxerxes the king, make a decree to all the treasurers in the province beyond the river. Whatever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, requires of you, let it be done with all diligence. Up to 100 talents of silver, 100 cores of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of oil, and salt without prescribing how much. Whatever is decreed by the God of heaven, let it be done in full for the house of the God of heaven, lest his wrath be against the realm of the king and his sons. We also notify you that it shall not be lawful to impose tribute, custom, or toll on any of the priests, the Levites, the singers, the doorkeepers, the temple servants, or other servants of this house of God. And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God that is in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people in the province beyond the river, all such as know the laws of your God. And those who do not know them you shall teach. Whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on him, whether for death or for banishment or for confiscation of his goods, or for imprisonment. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of our fathers, who puts such a thing as this into the heart of the king, to beautify the house of Yahweh that is in Jerusalem, and who extended to me his steadfast love before the king and his counselors, and before all the king's mighty officers. I took courage, for the hand of Yahweh my God was on me, and I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me. Okay, so what words were important words or phrases there in that passage?
Son of. The house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. Lest his wrath be against the realm. My favorite phrase towards the end is steadfast love.
Yeah. Yep.
Not to be the Lord who put such a thing into the heart of the king.
Okay, good. Well, verse 1 begins with the words, now after this. And with these words, it indicates there's a gap, and indeed, the narrative here in Ezra has jumped ahead about 60 years. So this time is the peak of the Persian Empire. It was first during the time of Darius the king, and then during the time of Xerxes. And so we see a map up here of the extent of the Persian Empire. We can see that it spreads from the Balkans in the west all the way across the Middle East, all the way to the borders of India and down into Egypt as well. Some historians have estimated that this empire controlled 40% of the world's population. I don't know exactly how you estimate that with what we don't know about what's going on in the Americas or Asia, but anyway, some have estimated that. Well, also during this time, Xerxes began to attack some of the Greek city-states. He wanted to expand his rule and thought that these parts of Greece were vulnerable targets. And so let me magnify this a little bit here, what we're talking about. It's this area here in the Aegean. And remember, at that time, Greece is not a unified nation yet. It's still a lot of individual city-states. And sometimes they'll come together and unite for the purposes of fighting against a common enemy. Greece doesn't get united until the days of Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, some 150 years after the time we're looking at right now. The Greco-Persian Wars included the famous historical battles of Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. And if you follow this sort of purple line here, beginning over in what is now Turkey or Asia Minor, it kind of goes up, crosses the straits there, and then down through Thrace, down to Macedonia. And you can see here, there's an X down at Thermopylae, and then you come over to the east a little bit at Marathon. There's some of the major battles that Xerxes fought in this campaign that he made throughout the Greek city-states. In each of those major battles, though, the Greek city-states formed some alliances, and they rebuffed this Persian invasion. So the Greco-Persian Wars really marked a turning point for the Persian Empire. They stopped the westward expansion plans that Darius and Xerxes had, and their control over some of the spots around the Aegean Sea. So the wars didn't cost them any core territory, but they did have a financial and a military impact, and they weakened this perception that everybody had of Persian invisibility. Well, the Persian Empire survived another 150 years until they were overcome by Alexander, but the decline was set in motion during these years in the reigns of Darius and Xerxes. So we move from the time of King Darius in chapter 6 to the time of King Artaxerxes in chapter 7. And so here's a timeline we've looked at before to kind of refresh our memory of where we are on the timeline. We can see that the reigns of various Persian kings are here, and then we see some of the other books of other prophets that were written at that time. And then here's where we've been in the first 6 chapters of Ezra, this sort of 538 to 516 BC period of time. And now we're going to look at the second part of Ezra, which jumps us ahead and kind of focuses around the 458, 457 BC time frame. And then when we get to Nehemiah someday, Nehemiah jumps ahead a little bit more, another 30 years or so. And so during this time between Ezra and Nehemiah, there's kind of a loss of focus of some of the empire, and we see the moral decline beginning within the Persian Empire. It was also during this gap in time that the book of Esther was written, or the events in Esther occurred. And Lord willing, we'll take a look at those in a little more detail someday too. But Esther gives us a little bit of a glimpse. If you remember some of the stories there at the beginning of that book, we get a little bit of an insight into some of the debauchery that was going on around the Persian throne. So we see in Persia what's happened numerous times in history. This internal moral decay occurs, and then it leads to a military defeat of an empire. Well, in Ezra 7, verses 1 through 5 introduce us to Ezra by listing his genealogy. we see that Ezra could trace his roots all the way back to Aaron, who was the first priest appointed by God. And we read about that in Exodus 28, 1 and 2.
Then bring near to you Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him, and among the people of Israel, to serve me as priests, Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar.
So that record in Exodus talks about Aaron being selected by God to be the priest, and his family as well. So this is important, this lineage that Ezra can trace back to Aaron. It gives him credibility, establishes his eligibility to be a priest. And actually, we can compare that lineage with what is shown in 1 Chronicles 6. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but actually it gives us lineage, but in the opposite order that Ezra is giving it here, because Ezra is tracing from himself backwards, and then the lineage that's given in 1 Chronicles 6 is going forward. So it starts with Aaron. So the sons of Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, Ithamar, and then Eleazar fathered Phinehas, and then it kind of goes on down there. So you can compare those two if you want to, and you kind of see that one going forward and one going backward, but it reflects that same lineage. We note that Ezra is described here in verse 1 as a son of Seraiah. Well, the Hebrew word here for son can have more a generic meaning of descendant. So it could also mean a grandson or a great-grandson. And there are other places in this list where one or more generations is skipped and not mentioned. So that occurs at other places where it means more of a descendant than directly a son. Seraiah was significant because he was the last high priest before the fall of Jerusalem. And he was executed by Nebuchadnezzar at the town of Riblah. And we read of this in 2 Kings 25, 18 to 21.
And the captain of the guard took Seraiah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, and the three keepers of the threshold. And from the city he took an officer who had been in command of the man of war. And the 5 men of the king's council who were found in the city, and the secretary of the commander of the army, mostly the people of the land. The 60 men of the people of the land who were found in the city. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land.
So as Nebuchadnezzar comes and conquers Judah, he executes Seraiah at Riblah, so the last priest before the fall of Jerusalem. So it's been 130 years since that, where we are now with Ezra's time. So Ezra's probably the great-grandson or the great-great-grandson of Seraiah. Then we saw in the first chapters of Ezra that Joshua was a high priest, and he is also descended from Seraiah, but through a different son. So Joshua and Ezra are related. They're distant cousins. Probably Ezra was the grandchild of Joshua's cousin. So that kind of a familial relationship. God shows that he's preserved his priestly line, and he validates Ezra's authority by giving this list of names. It also gives believers the assurance that this same faithful God precisely sees over our lives today. In verse 6, we read that Ezra went up from Babylonia. So Babylon is still one of the principal cities in the Persian realm. It was a major royal seat, and Persian kings would conduct some of their administrative business there. They had other capital cities or main royal cities. We've seen this before. We talked about Susa and Persepolis. And so sometimes the kings would move around and occupy different cities. Babylon was still a key place, so no surprise that that Ezra would be there and that the king would be there to talk with him. Well, the priests were to serve God in the temple, attending to sacrifices and worship. But now that the temple has been destroyed, the role of the priest changes a little bit. They couldn't offer the sacrifices in the temple because there's no temple. So they're focused more on being experts in the law and teaching the law. They taught and interpreted the law for the people, and they had a role in preserving the law as well. So we see Ezra is referred to as both a priest and a scribe. He was skilled in the law of Moses, which Yahweh had given to his people. And later we read that Nehemiah had an official position in the king's court. We don't see that about Ezra. We don't read that he has any official position, but he does have a connection there. He has the king's ear in some regard, and it says that he does have the king's blessing and favor. So the king granted Ezra what he had requested. We don't have a recording of that request, but we can draw some conclusions from the letter that the king writes, which follows. Well, more importantly, we read that God's hand was upon Ezra. This is the first of several times in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah where we read these words, that God's hand was upon him. It's clear from the first appearance of Ezra into the narrative that any success he had came because God was with him. Now, accompanying Ezra were some of the same groups of people that were on the first journey back to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel and Joshua. There were priests and Levites, there were singers and gatekeepers, there were temple servants. The only information we're given about the journey is that it took 4 months. They arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month after having left in the 1st month. It seems like this was less time than the journey took for Zerubbabel some 80 years earlier, and that's probably because Ezra's group was a much smaller group. He's got around 2,500 people. Zerubbabel had nearly 50,000 people. And again, we read that the hand of God was upon him. So this suggests that there was a safe and perhaps a quick journey. Ezra set his heart to study the law and to do it and to teach it. He was committed and determined. It reminds us of what we read about Daniel in Daniel 1:8 and 9.
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs.
Just as God granted Daniel favor in the eyes of his supervisors, God grants Ezra favor in the eyes of the king and the whole court. Ezra loved the law. He had a burden to obey it himself. He also had a burden to teach it to his countrymen so that they would also obey it and walk in God's ways. In verses 9 and 10, we're given a lesson that is often repeated in Scripture. God's will and man's devout efforts are both at work here. God's hand is upon Ezra, blessing his life. Ezra set his heart to study the law and to do it and to teach it. God is sovereign and in control of kings and history. He also calls us to actively use the spiritual gifts he's given us for the kingdom. In the New Testament, Paul writes about this in Philippians 2:12 and 13.
So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure.
So in Daniel, we learned that Daniel resolved and God gave. And here in Ezra, we see that Ezra is applying himself and God is blessing. Well, then the next thing that we see here in chapter 7 is the text of the letter from Artaxerxes. He wrote a letter and gave it to Ezra. This letter served as a letter of introduction and authorization that he could use as he traveled to Jerusalem and then as he got settled there. We don't know how this letter came to be exactly. It was written after the events recorded in Esther, so maybe there are some influential Jews within the king's court that persuaded him. Or maybe Ezra requested permission directly from the king and it was granted because the king trusted Ezra. Whatever human mechanism may have occurred, it's clear that God was moving the king's heart to bring this about. Ezra is described as a priest and a scribe, learned in matters of the commandments. He was the perfect man for this job. We learn later that after the deaths of Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, and Zechariah, the people had strayed and they needed correction. Ezra's commitment to the Mosaic law was crucial to refocusing the spiritual lives of the Jewish people. Well, the king decrees, and in this decree, that would carry weight, and it would show his support for this mission that Ezra was on. Verse 13 says that the king reviewed the mission along with his council of top advisors. The mission was not to go and explore new lands or to construct buildings as previous missions had been. Ezra was to inquire about the spiritual condition of his people. This decree grants some specific freedoms to the people as they traveled and then after they arrived. First, the king granted permission for any Jew in his kingdom that wanted to go to Jerusalem with Ezra. They had permission to do that. He specifically called out the priests and the Levites who would be essential in restoring the worship and the temple service. And then in verse 16 we see that Artaxerxes gave Ezra silver and gold, and then he allowed him to go and collect more silver and gold throughout Babylon as he solicited for free will offerings. This decree also allowed them to make sacrifices. And verse 17 talks about the sacrifices they were to make and bringing animal sacrifices on the altar in the temple. The letter also gave them the freedom to make their own decisions about spending money. They could decide where this money needed to go. It sounds like the king had a pretty good idea of what they needed. Ezra must have described that to him as he talked about his God and his religion. And so Artaxerxes had some understanding of that, but they were free to make decisions about the money. And then they could take back with them any of the remaining temple vessels. So it sounds like the temple vessels that had been given to Zerubbabel when he returned maybe were not all of the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had originally taken from the temple. So now Joshua or Ezra is going to take back the remaining temple vessels. And then also Artaxerxes says, you can have whatever else you need for temple worship up to a certain limit. So he gave him a budget, basically. And he said, you have freedom to spend whatever you want within certain established criteria. And we see that in verse 20. Well, in verse 21, Artaxerxes directed all the treasurers in the province beyond the river to cooperate fully and expeditiously with Ezra and the group of exiles that were returning. The mission was important, and there were to be no delays in obtaining the necessary provisions. So the budget authorized by the king is shown in verse 22, and it's easier for us to kind of gloss over this. We don't really understand what these quantities mean, so let's try to dig into that a little bit. First, let's consider the silver. And let me mention before that even, in this list of things here, gold isn't even mentioned. Gold is mentioned earlier, but it's not mentioned here, so we don't know how much of that was involved. But here's this budget that Ezra has as he is in Jerusalem. First, he has 100 talents of silver. Well, a talent is a measurement of weight. It's about 75 pounds. So 100 talents of silver is like 3 3/4 tons of silver. So a huge amount. Or another way to look at this is that 1 talent of silver would be the wages for a common laborer for 20 years. So that's the size of this budget in silver. Then he's told he can have up to 100 cores of wheat. Well, a core is about 50 gallons. It could feed one person for 3 to 4 years. So 100 cores of wheat would provide for the priests and the Levites for quite a while as the Jews were establishing themselves and getting ramped up here. Temple functions could continue uninterrupted because of the provision for the priests. Then he's given up to 100 baths of wine. A bath is a liquid measurement, and it's equal to about 6 gallons. So the provision of 100 baths of wine indicates the importance of maintaining a full range of temple services and offerings, which were central to Israel's worship and this covenant relationship they had with God. Also, 100 baths of olive oil. Olive oil was used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for anointing, and it was also a part of the grain offering. The allocation of 100 baths of olive oil would ensure the temple lamps could remain lit, symbolizing the God's perpetual presence, and the priests could perform their duties. And then finally, the last part of the budget was that salt was provided without limit. Salt was essential in a number of ways in the ancient world, primarily as a preservative of food, but it also enhanced flavor as we know it today. And it was also part of the covenant rituals. We see this in Leviticus 2, verse 13.
You shall season all your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant of your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt.
So the silver had a more general application, but the rest of these are directed toward the Levites and the priests and the sacrifices and the worship that's going on or to be conducted in the temple. So God commanded that all the grain offerings would be seasoned with salt, and this symbolized the enduring nature of this covenant between God and Israel. The provision of salt without limit emphasizes the importance of maintaining that covenant relationship and the perpetual nature of God's promises. Well, then in verse 23, the king says that whatever is decreed by the God of heaven was to be done. Artaxerxes could refer to God in this way without actually acknowledging that he was the only God and the sovereign over all creation. To Artaxerxes, he was just another god to be appeased, to avoid the wrath of God falling on him or his sons, just like any of the other gods. He wants to protect his reign, and he wants to protect his legacy. To the Jews, this title, God of Heaven, was a reminder that though they were subject to an earthly king, their God was supreme over all earthly rulers. The acknowledgement of God's commands reflects the Jewish understanding that divine law was above all. And we see this in the familiar passage in Deuteronomy 6, verses 1 through 9.
Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules, that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over, to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your sons son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you Rise, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Artaxerxes just generally says, do whatever the king of heaven wants, but to the Jews, that meant this. They understood well what that meant. Well, the king's decree also exempted the priests, the Levites, and some others that served in the temple from paying any taxes or tolls. This was in line with the Jewish practice, and also that concept carries forward into our day. Paul writes along these lines in 1 Corinthians 9, 13 to 14, in more of a New Testament application of this.
Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel.
So the idea of they're providing for the leadership in the church, or back in Ezra's time, the leadership in the temple carries on. And in fact, even in our law, pastors are not tax exempt, but they do have some items that get treated a little bit more favorably. So some of these ideas have carried forward even to our own day. This provision ensured that the temple could function smoothly and that those serving were not hindered by financial burdens. That's the point here. Well, Artaxerxes wraps up his decree by empowering Ezra to establish a judicial system. He was to appoint magistrates and judges who knew the law of God. This reminds us of the advice that Jethro gave to Moses when he was being overwhelmed with judging the people. We see this in Ezra chapter 18, verses 21 to 26. I'm sorry, Exodus 18, 21 to 26.
Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you, you will be able to endure, and all these people will also will go to their place in peace. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. Any hard case they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves.
Moses took the advice and the wisdom of his father-in-law Jethro, and he set up this system of judges to help deal with disputes in the nation of Israel. In the same way, Ezra is commissioned to set up a judicial system. Moses was recognized as being a wise man, and the king here recognizes the wisdom and understanding that Ezra possesses. So Ezra is to set up the system to judge all the people who knew the law of God. The king believed this would bring peace to one of the far regions of his kingdom that were sometimes prone to problems. But it didn't stop there. Artaxerxes gave Ezra what we might say is an Old Testament version of the Great Commission. Let's read what Jesus said in Matthew 28, 19 and 20.
Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Well, Ezra's told, if you find anybody that doesn't know the law, go and teach them. So it's almost like this evangelistic permission that the king gives to Ezra. So God moved the heart of this heathen king to order the law of God be taught in his kingdom. The king believed that the Mosaic law could help bring order and responsibilities to some parts of his realm. And what a greater impact the gospel has as we teach others about the restoration, the hope, and the joy that it brings. We see in verse 26 that Artaxerxes expected Ezra to enforce God's laws and man's laws. He wanted to see his Persian laws enforced as well. He wanted to bring order to all parts of his realm. So Ezra was given great power in punishing those found guilty. He could confiscate property, banish someone from the community, he could imprison people, or he could even invoke the death penalty. Those who did not obey the law were to have judgment strictly executed on them. And this phrase, strictly executed, suggests that the legal system will be swift and rigorous in executing justice. This reflected the administrative efficiency that was a hallmark of the Persian Empire, but it also echoed the instructions that God gave to Moses in Deuteronomy 16, 18 through 20.
You shall appoint judges and offices in all your towns, that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not prevent justice, you shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you.
So God had prescribed to Israel a rigorous and a fair judicial system. Well, then finally, Ezra responded to the king's letter with blessing and praise to God. He blessed Yahweh, the God of his fathers. With this phrase, Ezra acknowledges the covenant relationships that God had made with the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He recognized God's sovereignty and faithfulness throughout the generations. And he also links himself with the godly line that was concerned with proper sacrificial worship. All this is wrapped up in this use of the phrase, the God of his fathers. Well, the letter had Artaxerxes' seal on it and his authority, but Ezra knew that it was Yahweh who moved the heart of the king. Artaxerxes still refers to Yahweh as your God rather than my God. He's still a pagan king. So all praise was due to God for putting the thought in the king's mind. The purpose of the decree was to bring beauty to the house of God. The privileges granted by Artaxerxes were to bring glory and honor to God, not to Ezra. God granted Ezra favor in the eyes of Persian leaders. It says the kings, the counselors, the mighty officers, Ezra had favor in their eyes as well as in the eyes of the king. God did the same thing for Joseph. We read this in Genesis 39, 1 through 4.
Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, and a eunuch, had brought him from the Ishmaelites, who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in the sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had.
God gave Joseph favor in the eyes of his foreign superiors. He gave Daniel favor in the eyes of his foreign superiors. And now God's given Ezra favor in the eyes of these Persian leaders. The Hebrew word used here, or that's translated here as favor, is chesed. It speaks of God's covenantal love for his people. Sometimes this word is translated as mercy or steadfast love. It appears in Psalm 136, which, if you'll recall, we read several weeks ago. We read it responsively, and it begins like this: Praise the Lord, praise the name of the Lord. Oops, I'm sorry, wrong psalm. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. And that refrain we kept repeating, for his steadfast love endures forever. Same word that we see here in Ezra. Well, Ezra knew that God's hand was upon him. His response was that he took courage. And so this is a lesson for us tonight as well. God grants us favor also. His steadfast love is evident to us. And we're called to respond too by taking courage, by obeying, and by walking faithfully each day. Well, I have a piece of art for us tonight, and this is actually a very famous artwork. It's a portrait of Ezra, the scribe, and it's in a book that's called the Codex Amiatinus. Now, it's called that because Amiatinus is a place near Florence, Italy, and that's where it is right now. But it originated in the northern part of England. And there were monks or scribes there that copied the Latin Vulgate Bible, and they did some of these illuminations along the way. It was produced around the year 700, so it's that old. So it was made in near Newcastle, not far from where Hadrian's Wall ends on the eastern coast of England. And actually, this part of England was evangelized by the Irish. The gospel went to them first, and they brought it across to Scotland and many northern parts of England. It's the earliest complete one-volume Latin Bible that survived. There's the whole book. The whole book weighs 75 pounds, so you can see it's quite a giant thing. Well, there are a few interesting things about this particular illumination. I'm going to expand parts of it here so you can see. First, you'll note that the halo around Ezra is gold leaf, and some of this blue area around the border, that comes from lapis lazuli, and the place they got lapis lazuli was Afghanistan. So that was rare and came from a long ways. The red pigments in here, some red pigments are more common. They come from lead, and there were lead mines nearby. But these particular shades are much less common. Some of them came from insects or other rare materials. So this was an unusual thing. A couple of other unusual things about this. Here Ezra is in Jewish priestly garments, which was a bit unusual because often at that time they would paint people in clothing they were accustomed to. So they might be in medieval clothing or something like that, but here they've used more authentic garments. And the bookshelf behind him is based on a bookshelf that is in a temple in Ravenna, Italy. So these priests somehow have an acquaintance and awareness of what's happening in Italy. It's from the 400s. There are, from the inkwell, there are some shadows. And generally, we think of this art as not displaying shadows until like the 15th centuries when that starts to appear in art. So this is very unusual. And also, Ezra here is writing. He's not merely copying. He's writing something down. So it's rare to have Old Testament people in some of these illuminations. They focus more on the Gospels and New Testament figures, but especially Ezra, one of the more obscure figures in the Old Testament. But it's painted by scribes, so they maybe feel a kinship with Ezra. The books in the bookshelf here, there are different books there. One of the books is the Octateuch, which is the first 8 books of the Bible. Another book has Kings and Chronicles and Job. There are 6 books of history, Psalms, books of Solomon, prophets, Gospels, epistles, Acts, and Revelation. So the entire canon of Scripture is there in that bookcase. And then at the top, there's a phrase that says, "The holy books having been destroyed by hostile disaster, Ezra, committed to God, restored this work. So that's our art history lesson for tonight. But just interesting the detail they went to and the care they took to generate this picture of, of a lesser Bible figure. Okay, well, let's have a little discussion here and some application as we look at what we went through in Ezra 7 tonight. What do we see about God or his character tonight?
God uses even non-believers in further the kingdom. Using the king as works to even provide the funds to rebuild it.
Yeah.
We've seen it before, but again, once again, God used a pagan man to achieve his purpose.
No.
It must have taken a bit of courage for Ezra, a scribe, to approach the most powerful man in the world at that moment.
Yeah. Well, then let's think about these next questions. In what way do you see God's hand upon you, or how do we see God's hand on our lives today? And then how can we respond to that?
I think we probably live a lot more fearfully than we need to, meaning I think I get concerned, if I share the gospel with this person, they're going to think I'm weird, or even a friend I get reluctant to share with. When first of all, I probably am making some of that up in my head, but to this question, like, why am I presuming that God's hand will not be upon me, and that I will not be granted favor in the eyes of this person that I'm good hearing? I'm not saying you're never going to be persecuted, but I can think of very few times where me sharing the gospel with someone, even like a stranger, was ever met with like just fierce hostility. So, why not have a little bit more of a, well, God has put someone in my way that needs to hear the gospel, not think, well, God's hand's going to be upon me to protect me if they're going to persecute me, or maybe to grant me some favor in this person's eyes. Why just presume that, they're going to be offended or something like that?
Yeah.
We said that I think it's answered prayer because I think earlier, sometime last year, I asked I want to be bold to share my faith, and I've been doing it more often. Usually with these strangers I'll never see again, just Tuesday, outside the dinner. I go to my car and this random guy comes up and says, "Hey, excuse me, sir." Very polite, and then the homeless dude, guy, and he's asking me for, can you help me out? But he didn't ask for money. He asked me, "Can you go and buy me this specific dish?" It's a tomato basil. So he kind of knew exactly what he wanted. It wasn't expensive. It's like something he probably like relatively cheaper. But he asked, like, when I got closer to him, I smelled drugs. So the first thing I said, you know what? I don't feel comfortable doing this for you. I tried to refer to the rescue mission, started talking a little, said not interested. So then the next thing I did was, hey, all right, and then let me tell you this. And then the first brought, you know what? You know what like Sunday was? It's no. And then I said Easter Sunday, resurrection, and then I started talking like Jesus, everything. Once I got into the sin thought, I gotta go. So the next thing is, I didn't let him go. I said, if you're gonna do some drug deal, no, don't do that. And then he said, I gotta go. And I found out he was going to some other, probably walked to the store or whatever, and tried to get a free meal. And I, you know what? And my thing, he knows he's convicted, but he didn't want to hear it. So I'm not at all afraid. I'm looking for like people I can share the gospel with.
Well, even in that, just in that situation, like, I had a friend that kind of fell out of, like, I'm not going to church anymore, I'm really not into it. She just vowed. And recently, I just literally yesterday had a conversation with her, And I kind of tabled it. I was like, well, maybe she's just in a bad time. But I think one thing's for certain, and I equate it to like death and taxes, is that we're all going to go through tribulation. I don't care how good your ride is. We're all going to go through tribulation, and that's what I felt God showed me. Was like, oh, he kind of like smiled and was like, hey, you get what I'm saying? Like, he was like, oh yeah, we're all on the same page. And she was really, really amenable to hearing what I felt about where my faith is and how in daily application and prayer, prayer and supplication and just giving great, thanks, just basic perfunctory things. And I was able to share that, and she was so grateful at the end of the conversation. And I didn't even know that she was down, or it went down a road that was difficult. I just kind of felt she was indignant at some point. It was just like, I don't subscribe to that because my problems they're not really being heard, or whatever it may be. It was something very, very indignant. But I was like, oh, God was like just showing me like, have faith. Like, the road's going to be bumpy, and all of our roads are bumpy for a reason. And so I respond with one thing is that he gives you these basic tenets of very simple things, bite-sized things. Be grateful, have faith, faith through prayer and supplication, and I don't try to go beyond that. So and what he was saying is that I kind of feel like we all deal with like sharing the word, but with all certainty, he's like, yeah, the road's gonna be bumpy.
Once you overcome the fear, it's like, hey, I want to tell you everything you need to know. So I feel like, even the phone calls, I think, I'm talking to you, and this is the last thing you need to know before you hang up with me. I'm trying to do some on the chat. Just today, the life insurance person. Like, dude, this is awesome. I was trying to do a concurrent conference call, so one guy responded, oh man, I found out after they cut it, like, oh man. So I said, that thing is there anything I can help you with? I said, no. So I responded like, no, actually, I was wondering if I could help you. But I left it like that. I thought, oh man, I was trying to leave the following part of your soul and your afterlife. But I didn't get that because I finished that question and then went to the conference call and came back and, oh no, person responded stuff. It was it'd be a perfect opportunity because I could just give them like text, and I don't have to sit there and I could have a pre-written like gospel message, just do little by little or whatever, and it'd be easier to keep them on there because you can't say sorry, I gotta go. And you read the whole thing, so it's all on. It's already on copy the record. So.
Okay, any final comments?